Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to members and guests of Committee for Perth's New Horizon webinar. I'm delighted to say we've 75 people registered for today's event. For those that don't know me, my name is Paula Rogers and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Committee for Perth. And we welcome you to the webinar, Future Generations Governance with the wonderful Taylor Hawkins. But before we begin, I would like to say Kaya Wandu, hello and welcome. In Perth today, we're on the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and I'm delighted to welcome Taylor, who's on the lands of the Darug people. And together we pay respects to elders past and present, and recognise all of those who have joined us on whatever part of Australia that they meet us today. In Perth, we're in the season of Gerran, which is the time of cooler weather. We've had an extraordinary heat wave last week, and it certainly is absolutely stunning here today, with dewy mornings and the blooming of red flowers like the red flowering gum and summer flame. I welcome two board members of the committee, Deputy Chair John Smoders and Paul Graham. Thank you for joining us today, and everybody that's with us. In terms of the format today, this event has been one that Taylor and I have been speaking about for quite some time, and it's really driven by the synergy between the values of the Foundations for Tomorrow and Committee for Perth. We share a commitment to independent and collaborative decision-making that advocates for future generations and enhanced livability for all. In terms of today, Taylor will present to us for about 30 minutes, and then there's an opportunity for you to ask questions. I will also have some of my own, but I expect to be flooded with questions. If you have a question, please submit them as they come up during the presentation, and one of my amazing team will be moderating them so that I'll be able to see them. And once we get to the Q&A, I will be asking you questions. We recommend that you use the speaker view if you want the best viewing experience. And if you have any issues, please use the chat button and speak to Kelly Woodall, who's our events lead. So I now get to introduce the wonderful Taylor Hawkins. She is a social entrepreneur and advocate dedicated to safeguarding the interests of future generations in Australia. As the Managing Director of Foundations for Tomorrow, Taylor has led efforts to address pressing social, economic and environmental challenges. In 2021, she spearheaded a national youth consultation, gathering over 10,000 responses. For our Perth 2050 report, we got 1,400 responses, and we know how much work that involved. So getting 10,000 responses is extraordinary. This was the largest survey of its kind conducted by young Australians for young Australians. Beyond her work with Foundations for Tomorrow, she serves as an advisor to the United Nations Foundations for the Future Agenda Initiative, and her leadership development expertise has seen her collaborate with organizations like Google, Adidas, Salesforce, all to cultivate future-ready leaders. Her contributions have been recognised through accolades such as Smart Companies 30 Under 30, New South Wales Young Achiever Awards, and her selection as one of 12 Kofi Annan Changemakers in 2023. We are in fabulous company, and I will now hand over to Taylor, and we look forward to answering your questions later. But a huge thank you, Taylor, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for that overwhelmingly generous introduction. I still never know what, I'm glad I wasn't up on the screen while you were talking, because I still never know what to do with my face when people say, introduce me in such a generous way. But thank you so much for having me. Firstly, would like to also acknowledge the Darug people whose country I get to live and work on. And it's so integral to this conversation, like Paula, you and I have had this conversation so many times, is First Nations wisdoms is the origin story of future generations thinking. Yeah. We cannot step past that. And because of that, we here in Australia, getting to live on such sacred country, have this incredible ability to be a leading force if we choose to accept that opportunity in the world with the oldest living culture and this incredible wisdom. But yeah, firstly, a huge thank you, Paula, to you, Kelly, and the rest of the team for having me today. I'm incredibly excited. And really can see the absolute alignment between this conversation and the values of Committee for Perth. So just incredibly excited to share a little bit. You have, I will say, stolen a bit of my thunder with the intro, because I was going to try and explain to everyone a bit about me and why I'm here in this context. You have done some of that for me, so I'm grateful. You've made my job a bit easier. But to help give context to maybe the level of assertiveness and confidence that I will move through some of these topics, I'll explain a little bit about how I've spent the last few years. So as you mentioned, number one, I've had the privilege of being a leadership development specialist for quite some time now, despite the useful age, and have had the chance to work with many really fantastic large-scale organizations over many years. And the point that I like to make with that is that some of the things that I'm going to speak about, a lot of leaders will perceive them to be the warm fuzzies, the nice to haves. And what I can tell you is I've been held accountable by organizations over multiple years to deliver on performance, to deliver on whether it is commercial bottom line, whether it is impact, whether it is employee engagement, etc. And so I have been held accountable and believe in holding others accountable to implementing strategies for organizations in governance, in leadership, in decision making that actually does deliver and isn't just a nice to have. Number two, bit of context, as I started Foundations for Tomorrow 4 years ago with two other incredible co-founders, Holly Crockford and Bianca Gobel, and we have spent the last 4 years building a movement for future generations here in Australia. We have not done that alone. We have had incredible collaborators across the Intergenerational Fairness Coalition, those who've supported the Parliamentary Friendship Group that we established, including wonderful Paula herself. And we then spent 2 years developing the For Our Future policy brief. So we spent 2 years mapping the existing policy interventions in Australia for safeguarding our future, what's already been done, because we knew we weren't the first ones to think about this. And shout out, I believe she's on this call, the wonderful Amy Furlong did a huge amount of leadership in that work. And so our volunteer team that is spread all across the country has cultivated real leadership on this subject matter to the point that we spearheaded the introduction of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill here in Australia in February this year. This landmark legislation, which I will talk more about later, made us a first mover in the follow-up of the Declaration on Future Generations that was adopted by the UN in September of 2024. So that context gives me a great passion and belief in the Future Generations agenda and the movement that surrounds it, which I will give more context to later. But I've also spent a fair bit of time working in sort of the World Economic Forum space, looking at strategic futures foresight, working with the Global Foresight Council there and the Global Futures Councils, thinking about how we can meaningfully and practically integrate truly innovative policy into private sector, community organizations, but general organizational structures, and do it in a way that is bold, yes, but is aligned with the risk tolerance that we can meaningfully expect leaders to be able to embrace. And lastly, I was fortunate to have a front row seat to the development of the Declaration on Future Generations, so we will nerd out on 1 or 2 of the articles within that declaration later on in this conversation. But with all that being said, enough about me. I'm incredibly grateful that you have chosen to give me an hour of your time. And so with that, here's some of the things that I hope to cover and hope to offer to you in the time that we have. Number one, a little bit of context. What is this landscape, this agenda? Where did it come from? What does it overlap with, which is an incredibly important part of this conversation? Number two, the Australian leadership that has taken place in this space, which I'm incredibly proud of. The imperative for us to act. Practical tools for implementation, and then space for discussion, because those of you who don't know, I spend most of my time facilitating workshops, so this one-way dialogue is not my happy place. So I really look forward to us opening that dialogue and hearing any questions that you have, be they complex, simple, any of them will make me very happy to get to actually chat about this with you all. But to start with the origin story that wonderful Paula already touched on, the birth of our focus as an organisation came from this national youth consultation that we ran. We broke some records, we did some really fantastic work, and the upsetting thing is when we took this report to Parliament House, I thought I was going to change the world. Nobody really did anything. The results of this consultation went not very far, if I'm being pragmatic in retrospect. And at the time, that caused me a great deal of frustration. I'm not a patient person at the best of times, and so spending a year getting 10,000 young people to raise their voices only for them to not be meaningfully acknowledged was a bee in my bonnet, to say the least. And so I started on a bit of a mission to see surely there were other countries that were doing something meaningful and something effective about the short-termism that we were seeing in policy, about the lack of intergenerational collaboration, about the lack of mutual respect between generations. And so one country at a time made a spreadsheet with every country in the world and looked at what they were doing, what was going well, what was maybe going not so well. There's plenty of examples of that. And in doing that, I discovered the Future Generations Policy movement and all of the initiatives that have come to be a part of this. Now, this is not an exhaustive mapping, but the examples that you can see is everything from Wales, who was the first country in the world to legislate the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. They introduced the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which established a Future Generations Commissioner, which established bespoke, localized wellbeing goals that safeguarded everything from their environment to their Welsh culture. And they have since been a world leader in this space. And I know that you will be fortunate enough to have the formidable Sophie Howe coming and speaking to you in just a couple of weeks. But this also ranges from whether it's the Scotland Futures Forum, the Finnish Committee for the Future, the Singapore Centre for Strategic Futures, the recently established Kenyan Caucus for the Future. And so this is spreading globally in a really fantastic way and successfully delivering against policy objectives. And so within all of this context, we then wanted to see how can we do this in Australia, which is how we set to developing, as I mentioned, the For Our Future policy brief. But let's just pause and define what is the Future Generations agenda, because for some of you, it might feel familiar, and that's absolutely valid. It builds on the Sustainable Development Goals, it builds on the 2030 agenda, but it is a growing global movement to ensure that the decisions we make today do not come at the expense of tomorrow. As mentioned, for the SDG 2030 agenda, boffins in the room, this is exactly the heart of sustainable development, which is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own need. So this is not new either on a historical front with First Nations leadership, nor on this movement's front. We have been building towards this conversation for a long time. And the Future Generations agenda really emerged in strength in response to the growing volatility of our world, the need to inject some more concrete and maybe even bold ideas into the sustainable development conversation, because I'm sure I don't need to tell people on this call, the SDGs are a victory of the multilateral system. Put simply, we would not get them again today. So as much as they have their flaws and their gaps, they are a huge asset of the international community, but we're not doing well at landing them. We are not doing well at delivering against them, and that is the responsibility of our governments, of our business leaders, of our communities. We all need to step up. And this is so much of what the Summit of the Future was about, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. But within this context, the Future Generations agenda is really the bold how of the sustainable development movement. It's looking at future generations' governance. How do we establish formal mechanisms such as future generations commissioners in government, such as intergenerational guardians in organizations that step out of the inherent biases that we have as people and that the systems and structures that we have set up create as well. It's about looking at integrated policy design and also considering what is future generations leadership? What do we need to do as individuals in ideal environments and in environments that disincentivize long-term thinking to help us as a community, as a society, as a world, overcome the short-term pressures that are really bearing down on our future potential. Because, and this is one of my favorite quotes, I was there when she said it, but unprecedented does not mean unexpected. The incredible Dr. Sophie Lewis, we've had the fortune of working really closely with her. The Future Generations agenda really responds to this notion that we are hit by crisis after crisis. I'm sure you've all heard the buzzword polycrisis, but the reality is a lot of these shocks that we are experiencing could have been predicted and were predicted. COVID being an example of this. And so how can we learn and establish systems that will better anticipate these challenges? This isn't about predicting the future, creating the concept that we can predict a singular future and what's going to happen, but this is about an anticipatory approach to the potential futures ahead of us and responding as leaders in a suitable way to those realities. So back to the Summit of the Future, this took place in September of last year and was a landmark moment. As someone obsessed with this agenda, the fact that I got to be heavily involved in this whole process was, career highlight. And it was touted as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to reimagine the multilateral system, to redouble our efforts on sustainable development. And one of the huge outcomes of this summit was that we had the Pact for the Future, which within it had an annex, which was the Declaration on Future Generations. And Article 28, if you ever want to have a read, scroll all the way down, it gave a specific mandate for whole of government approaches to the coordination, including national and local levels, of the assessment, development, implementation, and evaluation of policies that safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. This meant that for the first time we had a robust narrative that national action by governments was expected by the UN, and that all of our wonderful member states, not all, a majority of, had voted in favour of, to say, yes, we want to be held to this standard, yes, we believe this is required. And it brings me incredible pride to say that Australia, by a bit of planning, was one of the first to meet this call. So in February of this year, only 5 months after the introduction of the Declaration on Future Generations, we introduced the Wellbeing of Future Generations Bill here in Australia, in Australian Federal Parliament. Through a cross-partisan collaboration between Dr. Sophie Scomps and Ms. Bridget Archer, we were able to introduce legislation that would, if it was passed, install a positive duty to consider the interests of future generations, establish a national wellbeing framework to define what wellbeing truly means beyond GDP, and that it would establish a Future Generations Commissioner whose mandate is not just to punish those who fail to think about the future, because the reality is, in the system we've created, it is so incredibly hard to be a future-driven leader. But the role of the Commissioner would be to coach, to support, and it's something that I'm sure Sophie can share more about, as she held the first of these roles in the world. But so with all of this, the so what? We must ask ourselves. And the so what that I will start with is that we have a pressing and unrelenting moral imperative to start thinking as future generations leaders who understand that we are custodians, we are stewards. The heart of the meaning of leadership is for us to be that steward of our community, of the organization, of the teams that we work with. The next thing that I will say is that while this moral imperative is overwhelming, because if we respect human rights across space, shouldn't we respect them across time? I will then argue that, frankly, let's put a pin in that argument, because the strategic imperative for doing this work is even stronger. And we do not even need the moral imperative to argue why we need to be embracing this agenda, why this is smart business, why it is smart leadership, smart management, to start to embrace some of these innovative policy ideas. Now, I promise I will back up that argument with some key points. This presentation, this single section of this presentation could go for 3 hours. I've done my best to narrow it down to a few key points. So number one, embracing the future generations agenda enables us to engage with our stakeholders in a way that builds trust and loyalty. We've seen, and the data, whether it's from Deloitte, PwC, Edelman Trust Barometer, that gaining the trust and loyalty of stakeholders, be they clients, be they investors, be they partners, is more and more becoming tethered to our concept of service to community, purpose, investment in sustainability. And that can engender itself on whether it is being an advocate for gender equality, whether it is advocating for sustainability, taking care of the climate. All of these are micro versions, but the well-being of future generations agenda looks at the source of the problem and says, let's not just fill the hole that's coming up with gender equality, with the environment, with the housing crisis, with the cost of living crisis. You can see the point I'm trying to make. Instead, let's change the machine that's churning out these poor outcomes and create a system of governance in our government and in our organizations that is actually stewarding us towards a better future. And so by embracing this, you're taking a more holistic approach and responding to market demand. Number two, it's a fantastic way to retain top-tier talent and foster high-performing cultures. So number one, if we start at the concept of attracting and retaining fantastic talent, it's often something that I'm engaged to help organizations do. We look at employer brand, we look at employee experience, we look at the development opportunities that they have within an organization. And as much as the data is showing that things like flexibility, reward structures are still hyper-relevant, the one that is really emerging and so consistent across generations is this sense of purpose, is this sense that the organization that they are working with is actually doing something for the world. And that can also help to combat some of these incredible trends that we've seen in presenteeism and absenteeism, meaning that you have the talent, but you're not getting the most out of them. And this connection, this sense of I understand what we're trying to achieve and why, and I really back the ethos and the mission that we are striving for as an organization, as a team, as a company, as a community group, that will enable you to get the best out of your team, out of yourself. Thirdly, If you embed adequate intergenerational collaboration, foresight practices, it can help overcome the short-termism. It can help to erode the impact of biases that they have, because by simply putting people of different generations around a table, you are able to overcome some of the temporal bias. So the fact that we always favor short-term benefits over long-term investments. It's just the primitive nature of our wonderful brains. And so by creating an approach that embeds foresight, embeds intergenerational collaboration, you are actually safeguarding your organization against some of the biggest threats. Once again, back to that point of just because it's unprecedented doesn't mean it was unpredictable. We can see some of these things coming, and by doing this, we can overcome that short-termism that gets in the way of us really seeing these points all too often. It saddens me, quite frankly, that I can't go into the many more reasons that I have for this, but we'll stick with the 3 for now. Maybe in the Q&A we can cover more, because I did not want to overwhelm with information. But my key takeaway on this one is there is a overwhelming moral imperative that I hope strikes every leader. And if you chose to come to this event, I'm going to take it that you're already compelled by the moral imperative. And I would then tell you, we don't even need the moral imperative to show how necessary and worthwhile this is from an organizational perspective. So what we're going to do now is dive into the practicality, because I know it is incredibly easy for me to talk platitudes and talk about how we can better consider the future in our work. What does this look like in practicality? Give me concrete examples. That is exactly what I'm about to do. So practical examples, we're going to start, and this is a bit of a fluid structure, but we'll start at the top of that sort of governance robust structure piece, and we're going to work our way through the organization just with a couple of examples that I really enjoy. So number 1, embedding stewardship in governance. This is going straight to the core of those often rigid and tricky constitutional documents, key policies, how we run our boards, and looking at how we interact with the concepts of stakeholder versus shareholder value. What are we reporting to? And so this is the idea that we can embed future generations thinking into these foundational governance structures. I'm actually due to go to the strategy day of an organization tomorrow who's looking at exactly this. And it's incredibly exciting because by hardwiring in the same way that on the federal level with the advocacy work towards government, we're saying we want this to be legislation so that it is safeguarded against transitions in leadership. This is the same concept for an organization. How can you hardwire stewardship into the way your organization functions so that it is safeguarded between leadership handovers? You know, I've designed entire values and leadership frameworks for organizations to then have a CEO changeover and the new CEO decide to throw it all out because it wasn't finalized yet and it wasn't their project. And so what we want to do is make sure that these are protected against that sort of being at the whim of the day. A really fascinating example of this is Patagonia. In 2022, they transitioned to a stewardship model. So they have 100% voting shares were transferred to a purpose trust, and all of the profits now go to a nonprofit focused on climate and nature. By doing this structurally, what they've done is create the incentive structure and the reporting requirements that they have to cross-check all of their work with, is this in the best interest of climate and nature, which is really fascinating and fantastic. And I'm sure that if I say the word Patagonia, we're not sitting here going, wow, that's a company that no one's heard of and that isn't doing that well. This is a company that has really built its entire brand on this idea of putting the planet first. The next chunk that we're going to go through is actually probably more within what we'll all be incredibly familiar with. So incentivizing intergenerational thinking. Once again, to the point of we can't just punish leaders, punish team members for failing to think long term when we consistently put them in systems that do not incentivize them to think long term, that do not support them to do it, and don't require them. If you're not incentivized, supported, or required to do something, it's pretty random acts that have you doing it. So with that, what we can do is look at the fact that if we start removing some of the short-term KPIs, extracting what the long-term vision associated with them is, this isn't about completely surrendering commercial success, surrendering the idea of a strategy. We want to hold on to those, but we can do it while also looking at what we measure, the risks we tolerate, and how we reward. So number 1, what we measure. How are we defining success? We can truly embed social, environmental, and community well-being metrics into how we evaluate the performance of our leaders. Number 2, the risks that we tolerate and how we frame the risks that we are so invested in addressing. What you can do is look at how you calculate real risks, how you account in financial modeling, asset strategy, natural capital accounting for the risks of climate degradation, for the risks of community exclusion. This is not just an environmental conversation, as much as that is the origins of where my advocacy work started, so I will forever be loyal to the climate movement, but this actually applies to so many different intersections because, as I'm sure I don't need to tell anyone on this call, organizations, teams, any group of people is impacted by the social, the environmental, the economic environment that they're in, the political environment. So all of these variables, all of us being invested in the well-being of current and future generations holistically is in our benefit. Thirdly, how we reward. So what are the incentive structures that we are giving to people and what are we rewarding them for? It's really important to look at those and see what are we telling that person is the number one thing that they've got to achieve. And is there anything in the way that we're incentivizing them that actually tells them that they will be rewarded, respected, and understood for prioritizing some of these more well-being social impact elements? It's throwing me out that I can't see anyone's face. So I hope I haven't lost you all. I'm sure Paula will jump in if I've lost the plot. But the next one, and this one has me absolutely on the edge of my seat at the moment, is the concept of intergenerational guardians. So this is the mirror equivalent of the Future Generations Commissioner. So that's the independent sort of government person who advocates for the interests of future generations, who coaches political leaders in how to develop better policy, who encourages them to collaborate across departments, all in advocating for the interests of future generations, because that commissioner is popped out of the system enough, isn't restricted by the current structures of how we measure success, how we tolerate risks, and how we reward people. So that person, by being removed from these short-term incentives, can be a more effective advocate. Similarly, the concept of an intergenerational guardian inside an organization, Sydney Water, to my knowledge, is the first organization, at least in Australia, to trial this. They wrote a fantastic abstract. It was recently spoken about at a conference, but it's not actually too widely discussed beyond that. They've developed and piloted this innovative approach of appointing intergenerational guardians to participate in essential strategic meetings, governance environments, in order to advocate for that intergenerational mindset. And thus far, it's still very much in development, so I can't speak to the long-term impact of it, but the reception that they're having for this, not only in the outcomes of those strategic discussions, but the engagement of their team, the interest of different team members to be trained up, be upskilled in this sort of role, and to play that role is fantastic. And then once again, if you upskill an individual to play that role in meeting number one, they carry that competency with them in other conversations. So as much as you're then not creating this formal structure for them to do it everywhere, you're then mobilizing and shifting a culture, shifting a baseline culture where people are more aware and have been told and given permission to be this sort of advocate, which is super powerful. We also have a slight spin on this concept, Japan's future design. It is representing hypothetical future voices. And so bringing that concept of how would future generations feel about this. Very similar concept to the intergenerational guardian. This was within more of a hypothetical scenario planning context, but has delivered really fantastic policy outcomes and has been used repeatedly within the Japanese context. Now, if we bring it down one more level, there's two sort of more basic concepts that are actually popularized definitely outside of this agenda, but are integral parts to this conversation, which is number one, futures thinking and strategic foresight. How can we embed this practice into the way that we do strategy? And that's not just having a 2030 plan, 2050 goals. It's not just about having a strategy that goes to 2027. It's about how can we look at the potential future scenarios that we're facing? How can we anticipate the risks and opportunities and be ready to capitalize on them for the betterment of everyone? And lastly, we have intergenerational collaboration. This is the first time ever that we have 7 generations alive at once. This is the first time ever that we have a 5-generation workforce. And so number one, and this is actually a whole other keynote that I'm doing in a couple of weeks, but intergenerational collaboration is one of the biggest strategic imperatives for organizations with regards to culture, with regards to leadership performance, that we need to tackle, and we need to tackle it quickly, because I believe it was only, Forbes said 6% of leaders feel comfortable managing intergenerational teams. 6, which is not very high, in case anyone else is trying to work out. I do mean only 6 out of 100 leaders feels confident managing an intergenerational team. And we're entering a space where increasingly this will be the case, especially as digital literacy is thrown into the mix. You will have younger people excelling based on their digital competencies, creating more generationally mixed teams. And so facilitating intergenerational collaboration, skill building your team so that they have competency in that space will be absolutely essential. And so I hope these examples outline a few of the ways that we can really practically integrate these ideas, which brings me to sort of my second question like this. Now what? Let's say you're incredibly inspired by this conversation. Let's say I have convinced you that the strategic imperative is strong enough and that you want to take this back to someone in your organization. I hate to break it to you, and too often in my work I have to say this. If I had a silver bullet for you, I would be able to retire already. Sadly, all of these things do require a tailored approach. We have to meet organizations, teams, and leaders where they're at because, and I've seen this happen so many times, if you try and race into the bold ideal outcome, you can lose all the goodwill, you can fracture the trust in the promise of progress by people going through what can be a very bumpy and troublesome ride, which is change and transformation, if you're ill prepared for it, and if you're not bringing people on the journey, and if you're not responding to the realities and the opportunities of the team as well. So with that, I do want to leave you with some sort of concept of like a helpful step-by-step. So if I was in your position right now, feeling incredibly excited by this, ready and raring to go, here are the things that I would suggest that you do. Number one, reflect. Get incredibly honest about why you're interested in this, what the purpose you think doing this will play, and that will also play into the level of ambition that you should and do have for this sort of policy innovation. It's also worth considering why this is not something you would want to do. There are risks to this sort of policy innovation, and any initiative to pursue these ideas should be done with an awareness of the tricky parts that can come with this. And that's not unique to this agenda. Any cultural transformation initiative that I've done with an organization has many risks to it. You're tinkering with a system that a lot of people are relying on. Number two, audit where you're currently at. Look, organization top to bottom or bottom to top, a little bit of both, and understand how are we currently performing in the verticals that you care most about, whether that is strategic foresight and futures thinking, whether that is intergenerational collaboration, whether that is really robust incentives and requirements for your leaders to think about the future. Are they entirely absent? Are they there but more gestural? Do they work sometimes and not in others? Is it a gentle cultural expectation, but not one that people advocate for? Auditing where you're currently positioned in that space is essential. Then doing a bit of a reality check. Define the level of innovation that you have the risk tolerance for, that you have the executive buy-in for, and that you have the resources that you're willing to allocate to it for. Once again, the worst thing is to go out with a bold vision, half do it, break the trust of all the people you engaged in it, and then fracture their belief in this agenda. Better to be measured, be methodical, and I am the biggest believer in being bold and ambitious, but doing it within the context and understanding of maintaining that trust of the stakeholders you bring on the journey. Number four, co-create. The development of future generations policy initiatives, specifically within organizations that are far more agile than government. This is a creative leadership development opportunity that you can invite your leaders into, even invite junior staff into and say, how could we co-create this? There's a huge design thinking opportunity here. And you can then sculpt bespoke approaches. And by having people co-create that journey, they're so much more likely to support it, to be champions of it, and it's far more likely to succeed. Once again, that is not a unique truth to the Future Generations agenda. That is true for organizational change. And lastly, iterate and scale. As mentioned, I had a spreadsheet with every country in the world. I can tell you, having looked at, dare I say, every attempt that has been made to implement Future Generations policy, at least in government, most have gone really well and some have gone terribly. And there are some variables that you need to monitor for that. So are we balancing pragmatism with the idealism of this concept? Are we making sure that we are creating an inclusive future? Whose future are we creating? What is the vision that we're moving towards? Because if that's a singular one-person future, we can be perpetuating inequities that we would like to get rid of today. And so we've really got to think about, what are we driving towards? What do we need to iterate? How can we monitor this implementation? And then when we've realized that we've hit a sweet spot, how can we scale it? How can we turn this into something that lasts beyond the tenure of any leader and becomes just the way we do leadership? Because, and I said this earlier, the core of leadership is stewardship. It shouldn't be about ego. It too often does become it, but we should be stewards. We should be custodians of the purposes, the organizations, the communities that we lead. And so this is truly a no-brainer. I realize I'm coming up on the end of my time, so a quick recap on things that I covered today is number one, we have a global mandate. Member states have signed on to this. There is global permission that we should be investing in this. And just like the SDGs, we cannot do this without business leaders. We cannot do this without community and organization leaders. Number two, it's really fantastic to see that Australia is leading in this space, but the amount of leadership we've shown so far versus where we can get to, based on the incredible wisdom that this country holds, based on the opportunities that we have, the incredible natural resources, etc., we have such a long way to go in the leadership that we can show. We spoke about the business imperative, which does not even need the moral imperative as a leg to stand on. It is a strong enough argument in and of itself. We went through some practical implementation strategies, which I'm sure have got some of your cogs turning a little bit, and then path to impact, a few checklists that you can move through. A few final words from me, though, is we are excitingly launching our state-based mobilisations, and WA is actually one of our priority jurisdictions. And as of just a couple of weeks ago, we've launched For Tomorrow WA. So we will be working closely with a whole selection of fantastic community champions, civil societies, political champions, etc., to mobilise this agenda within the policy landscape in WA. So if you have an interest in that, absolutely please do reach out. And otherwise, I will be in WA over the coming months. So if any of this was interesting to you, I would love to talk to you about it more. But I believe we're about to have the chance to do that even more right now. Paula.
Fantastic. I love the way your presentation walked us through your amazing experiences and insights. And yeah, I just think the way you have clearly shown, you know, it's a bit like the duck at the top, all the work that you have done. You make it look quite simple, but actually you also remind us of the risks that there have been. And I know from conversations that we've had, this has been a long journey. And there was a period of time when people weren't listening to you. And now it's wonderful to see people engaging and listening to you. When you talk about the Future for Tomorrow and the WA group, I'm thrilled to say we've got Mayor of Fremantle, Hannah Fitzharding, Brett Hart and Linda Savage from as part of that group that are on this call today. So I'm thrilled that they are here with us. Hannah has had a comment. She said, amazing presentation, Taylor. Congratulations on the introduction of the Private Members Bill to the Federal Parliament. We'd love to see similar legislation here in WA. What sort of reactions have you had from stakeholders, both in the Parliament and outside? Great question, Hannah. Over to you, Taylor.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And that is that's a favour of a question to me. It's letting me spruik some of the good news that we got, which is, you know, this, and as Paula alluded to, when I started running around Parliament House banging this drum about 2.5 years ago, nobody wanted a bar of it. People thought that I was insane, and somehow in the 2.5 years since then, it's become cool. I often make the joke that I feel like the kid who kind of got cute over summer and is kind of weirded out by the fact that people now want to talk to me. But what we saw with the introduction of the bill is everything that we could have hoped for. Realistically, we could have pushed incredibly hard before the federal election, tried to get some commitments, tried to get some political champions to sign on. But the way that the bill was received, which was overwhelmingly positive, so much so that my obsessive self read every comment under every media article that we had, every social media post from Women's Agenda, the Daily Oz, the Guardian, etc. And I struggled to find any negative comments. There was a couple, but the most of the comments, and I have the screenshots to prove it, were, how is this not already a thing? How is it not already the case that our leaders are required to think about the future? So number one, the everyday citizen seems to be very much on board with this, and our survey and our research that we did with Griffith University and ANU says exactly this, that 97% of Australians want to see this sort of policy reform take place. The other thing that we saw was cross-partisan. Across the full political spectrum, we had either conversations already going or officers reach out to us saying, if we make it through the election, we'd love to talk about this more because it's a really promising agenda. And I think particularly in a period of time that is so wrought with polarization, having agendas like this that genuinely align with the base values of, you know, every major political party in this country, that is a really powerful force for us to say, we should all get this across the line. So yeah, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, so much so that we're sort of protecting that little golden egg until after the election, at which point we will enter, you know, productive but robust conversations with the new government.
Fantastic. One question I had, you've alluded to organisations being interested in it. Do you have any examples? Is it through the CEO, or is it through people and culture, and where the success level is greatest?
That's such a great question. So I'm transparent to a fault. So the first thing I'll say is, with really pure future generations policy innovation within organizations, we are so much at the emergent edge of that work that there are very few case studies. I'm fortunate to have been involved with quite a few of them. But, from the foresight work that I do, because through Raksha Intelligence Futures and the World Economic Forum, a lot of those projects that I end up being across are very focused on that sort of deep strategic foresight process. I think that can go incredibly well. And if you look at some of the organizations, especially tech companies are really good at it, who harness this sort of work, it sets them up for great commercial success. It can often, when not paired with sort of cultural considerations, that intergenerational collaboration, this notion of making sure that we're looking to create a future that's truly inclusive and that erodes some of the dysfunctions and inequities of our present world, that alone can lead you a bit astray, because how are you creating that vision of the future that you're moving towards? And that's a really big tripping point that we see. I think that from the work that I have done, that sometimes starts in the leadership development space, but actually you end up moving into this futures thinking, because when you do the pain points assessment of the leaders in big enterprises that are having to, especially, those working in the science field, climate and the environment, etc., the pressure for them to try and predict the future and take care, especially purpose-driven leaders, is huge. And so I personally think that coming in through that capability lens, because at the root of this is leadership competence. Intergenerational collaboration is not complicated. If you are a skilled leader in collaborative conduct, in respecting people you don't understand, in being curious, intergenerational collaboration is no harder than cross-cultural collaboration, than gender equality, than any other notion that has you working with people who are not like you. So I think that coming through this lens, which is how can we build the skills of our leaders to, number one, be better at working in spaces and with people they don't understand, and number two, create the systems where they overcome the biases within our own heads and the biases and incentive structures in our system that stop us from thinking about the long term.
Thank you. Going on from that, when we had Sophie Howe speak in Perth last year in April, she talked about reverse mentoring. And it's something that I'm interested to know, have you seen it done well? Are there, and this is basically for those online, it's not about us mentoring young people and kind of sharing our enormous wisdom that we think we should share with them. It's the complete opposite, which is having a young person mentor a CEO.
Yeah, so this is one of those examples, which is, this is actually an intervention that has come from sort of other areas. I think it actually originated as a succession planning tool. I think the first company that started doing it was about how do we prep these young leaders to be strong advocates, strong communicators, comfortable in executive presence. And it has now become something that I would definitely believe is a really powerful part of a future generations sort of policy agenda within an organization. I've seen it done well many times. I've seen it done not so well sometimes. And I think, once again, it comes down to these things that are not new and are not complicated. What is the level of ego that leader is bringing to the table, and whether it is in what they say explicitly or what they give implicitly, are they creating a genuinely peer-to-peer environment where that person, that young person, can offer their reflections? But the people that I have had the chance to speak with, and this is up to CEO level, who have participated in reverse mentoring, I believe with people as young as, fresh out of university, they have gotten so much out of it, not only genuine strategic insights because of the sort of open-minded questions that young person can ask, but also the ability to provide counsel, someone who is so far removed from your position, who can hold space for some of the dilemmas that you face. And so I think it's a fantastic intervention, and is a low cost and low risk thing that you can actually run internally yourself pretty easily.
And how have you seen people kind of being kind of pragmatic on this to actually find their mentor or choose their mentors? Are there organizations?
That's actually a great question. I have only been involved in internally conducted reverse mentoring. And so the example that I have seen, and I've seen it a few times work really well, is you start with a reasonably powerful executive champion who says, I'm going to go first. I will do this first, and I would like to have a mentor, reverse mentor partnership. And they trial that for 3 months. They then invite other leaders in to do the same, and they partner it with, let's say, the grad program in the organization, the internship intake. It's also a great talent retention tool because all of a sudden you're getting a pulse and a feel for that entry level band in your organization, which outside of that context, you're unlikely to get an authentic feel for. So yeah, I think that especially if you're looking to, run it yourself and do it within your organization, having a champion lead the way and kind of test the idea, see how it resonates in the unique organizational culture that you're operating within, and then they can invite and slowly expand over time. Once again, goodwill and trust are really precious assets to maintain within these sort of transformation initiatives. And so there's no rewards for rushing, unfortunately.
And I do think that is certainly a really good message that you've had through your whole presentation, that rushing can actually cause more problems than waiting and going through the process in the best possible way. One of the questions that is online, and I'd encourage all of you, we've got 30 people still online, to ask a question. We've got a question: how do you balance optimism with pragmatism when addressing complex issues like climate change and social equity? Just a small question there.
And firstly, I'd be remiss if I didn't come back to this. I don't wish to give people an excuse for moving slowly. We must move with the burning imperative of the fact that our world is on a terrifying trajectory, to the point of this question. But it's about moving thoughtfully within that chaos, I think, is the important
balance. Agree. Sorry. Yes, I didn't mean that we just stop. No, I just mean that kind of like you've shown us the timeline.
Exactly.
So yeah, sorry.
Thoughtfulness, exactly. If we're all running around like our hair's on fire, we're not going to get too many good places. But how do we balance optimism and pragmatism? I think I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I think in the space of the last 3 weeks, I've been on a call about the nuclear destruction of the world, AI taking over our brains, and us all running out of water. That is quite heavy, depressing content, but naturally, by the nature of my work, that is the spaces that I'm often called to be in. And so I think relentless optimism is my oxygen mask. Like, it's the only way that I can navigate this space where I do have to be deeply pragmatic with leaders and say, okay, the tolerance or the elasticity of your culture can't let you get here in time, so we need to get you this step and then the next one. So I don't know that I can provide anyone with a step-by-step on how to achieve it, but I think that you have to hold on to the optimism with both hands, because otherwise it can just feel incredibly draining. And as leaders, we need to be able to draw that motivation out of people and show them that it's possible, because hope is the flywheel of progress. If we start losing hope, if we start losing optimism, the sort of social lubricant that enables us to actually change society, change the way we do business, change the way we lead, it evaporates so rapidly. And so I would rather that we invested in hope, and that can propel the momentum, than that we all got deeply depressed trying to solve sort of one challenge. I hope that helps.
And I agree with, like, for Committee for Perth, we are really kind of pushing at this focus to 2050 and beyond. And when I started in this role, I'm now in my 3rd year, when I mentioned 2050, people were saying, oh, that's too far away, that's too long to think. And then we got some of our members that are, some of the students that from the schools that are members, to speak to our members. And you have this tiny little year 4 student saying, in 2050, I'll be 32. And we've been doing things like this to remind people that the future is fast approaching, but we still have time. And I think the opportunity to imagine, like I love your quote there, hope is the flywheel of progress. That, it's a place where there's still time, there's still opportunity to do amazing things. And that's the place that the committee is really trying to advocate and get involved in. So, that kind of optimism and pragmatism is absolutely essential. In terms of,
I'll just jump in really quickly there, because I have enjoyed following your work on this topic. And I think that the thing that you're doing with Committee for Perth that really stands it apart from a lot of the other approaches that we see is that you're investing the human experience into the conversation about 2050, which is a really hard thing to do. And you're showing people trying to overcome that temporal bias and saying this person will be 32. They're meant to be the prime of their life at that time. And that's incredibly powerful hope weaving for all of the leaders who then need to be mobilizing on exactly this. So I think we need to see more people in the same way that we had the challenge with the science for the climate crisis existed for 50, 60, 70 years before anyone really did anything meaningful with it. We need hope and emotion and humanity on top of the information. And I think that you guys are doing a really fantastic job with that.
Oh, thank you. But it's incredibly impactful when you see a tiny citizen, but also when you hear things like their concerns. We asked what they hoped for and what they were worried about going towards 2050. And things like homelessness came up, climate came up. One of the students really talked so beautifully about wanting a world where people actually listened to each other rather than, listened to different opinions and were open to different opinions, which I think, imagine a world where that was the norm. One of the things, going back to countries, you talked about Singapore, and obviously being at the UN Future Summit in September last year. Were there any amazing engagements that you could share with us, countries in our neighborhood that you heard from that might inspire us?
I think I'll touch on some from the neighborhood and some a bit further afield. I think what I loved was the fact that, and it's an interesting, fascinating quirk of this this agenda, is that a lot of what the UN refers to as Global South countries are actually better at this work than Global North countries. So Western countries often are actually in the practice and implementation of intergenerational thinking far further behind, but Western countries have overpopulated and been very loud in this conversation, which means that many of the heavily platformed examples and conversations are Wales, Scotland, Finland, and we're looking very much at that sort of European example. But what I loved coming into the summit is that whether it was Kenya, Chile, Portugal, we were seeing these incredible examples of countries that kind of have come out of the woodwork, haven't been that vocal. The African Union doing some fantastic work to advance thinking intergenerationally and codifying what has been inherent in their leadership practice for a long time. So I found it very exciting that my desktop research did no justice to the status of this movement in the world. I was looking at the way that many Western countries were capturing the work that was being done. And so my landscaping entirely missed this incredible entrenched culture of leadership in so many countries, especially if you look at sort of individualistic countries, often Western, versus collectivist countries. It's just embedded in that notion, and to the point of that empathy piece, the core elements of future generations leadership are the most simple parts of leadership. It is not about being a futurist, a foresight practitioner, this, that, or the other. It's about being a curious, humble servant leader who is here to be a custodian of the community that you lead. It is about actually going inwards, winding it back a little bit, rather than trying to be the shiny cyborg leader who knows all the fancy lingo. It's the deep humanity of it all.
Wow, and neighbours close to us?
So we're working really closely with some leaders in New Zealand who are looking to advance their sort of wellbeing work and extend it into a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Myself and Claire Beaton-Wells, our wonderful head of government relations, actually spoke at a hui being run by the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in New Zealand, and they were bringing together cross-sectional stakeholders to talk about how they could wed this in with the work already being done in Maori culture, use it as a bit of a step against some of the backsliding that they're seeing in some of their wellbeing policy, and see how this can be an innovative way to safeguard that way of leadership. So there's really fantastic work happening everywhere.
Well, we're coming close. I'm just checking to see if we've got any final questions. We have held everybody that joined your presentation today, which is just wonderful. I think we've all been witness to somebody who is a curious, courageous leader who wants the world to be a better place. And we're so fortunate to have you here with us today. I really thank you, because your time I know you were online late last night, you were online early this morning. You are just so full on, and you have that feeling of urgency that here at the committee we have as well. In terms of Perth, as we close, we had the 2050 report, which we launched in November last year, and that was designed as this kind of, wake up and realize that it's 25 years till we get to 2050, and having those young voices and working collaboratively with other organizations is critical. We have a new state government following the election results. And a bit like, Western Australia is the size of Wales, and we had the Premier present at the committee last December saying that Perth needed a plan. And we have been talking about future generations thinking, as have many others. So all I ask is that you watch this space, and we are very excited to know that you're coming over here. One of the audience members from the Fogarty Foundation asked about when you're coming here and how to connect, and we will connect with them and obviously share your presentation with everybody from today. But on behalf of me, on behalf of everybody who's been here on the team, from the team of Committee for Perth, we just want to say thank you for agreeing to be part of this really informative presentation today. And we look forward to keeping up the conversation. You're an amazing champion, and anything that we can do to help you, please, you've got my number anyway we speak, but all of us in Perth, we're interested to welcome you. So everybody who's attended, you will receive the webinar presentation. Taylor has very kindly agreed to share that with us. We're always interested in ideas and opportunities where we can extend this conversation. As you know, we'll have the wonderful Sophie Howe speaking on the 17th of April at the Curtin City Campus, and make sure you register for that. And we've got another amazing female leader speaking on the 15th of May, Rebecca Tompkinson, who is the CEO of Chamber of Minerals and Energy. So it's been a wonderful afternoon. I just think these events are so great because within an hour, you just get such concentrated information. Your presentation was fantastic, and I wish you a fruitful rest of your day. And thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who has joined us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You take care. Thank you.